Ooh.
All right. Do we have a go to get started? Yes, fantastic. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I have three absolutely wonderful guests tonight to talk about the intersection of AI and democracy and to present work that's happening across different spaces. I'm going to start by introducing the three of you, and then we'll hop right in. All right. On this side of the stage, we have Julia Angwin. Julia, you're the award-winning investigative journalist who's also the founder of Proof News. We'll talk about what is Proof News and what it does. You're a best-selling author. You should read Julia's books. You're a contributing writer to the New York Times Opinion, and you're a fellow at the Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy over at the Harvard Kennedy School. Dr. Alondra Nelson. You're the Harold Linder Professor at the Institute for Advanced Study. You're a Distinguished Fellow at the Center for American Progress, and you're the former Deputy Assistant to President Joe Biden, the Acting Director of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. And finally, we have the Honorable Francisco Cisco Aguilar. You're the Nevada Secretary of State, the former General Counsel for the Agassi Graf and the Andre Agassi Foundation. I'm still not saying it right.
You're saying it right for a French woman.
I'll take that.
Lovely.
For Education, and the former Special Counsel to the Chancellor of the Nevada System of Higher Education. All right. Let's talk a little bit about why we're having this conversation today. And it's the combination of multiple factors. The first one is, of course, we are looking at this election super year. What does it mean? It means in 2024, almost 4 billion people around the world live in countries that are going to go through major elections. That's more than 83 major elections around the world. That includes elections like we just saw in Taiwan, but also elections in major democratic countries. Of course, the US, very top of mind, but also India, Indonesia, the EU parliamentary election, Mexico, South Africa. And so we're facing this year of super elections at a moment where we're also facing what some people have said is going to be the first AI elections. We are at the sort of beginnings of the mass adoption of these new technologies. Of course, we think about the types of AI-enabled chatbots. I know we've used them a little bit sometimes in the classroom where we're talking about ChatGPT, Claude, and everything that you can do with AI. Some of it is fantastic. Some of it can be pretty nefarious. We already saw, for instance, in Slovakia, people using AI to do, for instance, voice deepfakes in the context of elections. Another thing that's happening, if that's not enough to sort of like worry you a little bit already, is all of this is unfolding at a moment where in Silicon Valley, major tech companies are rolling back safety safeguards. We see this, we see them dismantling election security teams, and so there's a lot of pressure on a lot of folks to figure out what do we do to protect the integrity of elections at that moment, what type of new solutions needs to be invented, and how do we collaborate with one another? How do we hold tech accountable? How do we protect national, global, and regional elections? And so I'm going to ask this question to the three of you. I know that you're tackling it from different angles. And with this, let's start with you and what you're doing in Nevada to prepare for that special moment.
Absolutely. I think just misinformation as a whole is a threat to democracy. And so how are we dealing with misinformation, disinformation, and then you add in the complexity of AI and cyber attacks. And I think especially in Las Vegas and Nevada, when you're talking about disinformation, misinformation, it's also happening in Spanish, especially in our Latino community. It's happening through, WhatsApp, it's happening through churches, it's happening, and most people who are on the political trail don't understand what's being said. And so we have to go through that, kind of dissect each one of those statements of information that is not true. Now you add in the complexity of AI. And I have to tell you, we have 17 clerks across our state. 11 of those clerks are new because the previous clerks have decided they've had enough, or their family can't take the stress and the pressure of the job. And when you start talking about AI, This is a whole new area that we have to educate ourselves as elections administrators. And sometimes state governments, local governments don't have all the funding in the world to be able to deal with these new challenges. And in Nevada, we have a legislative session every other year. So we have to plan ahead for 2 years. Now you bring in new technology and a new front to the election space, we have to be creative about how we deal with this. And somebody asked me recently, who is very, very high up in the federal government, and said, what are you doing about AI? And I looked at him and I said, well, what are you doing about AI? Because as a local administrator of elections at the state level, you have all the resources in the world. You have the access to the experts. And we have to work together to figure this out. Because it's going to, coming from the private sector into government is quite an awakening experience. Things don't move as fast. And so you can't be as innovative as you wish you could be in the private sector. So this is going to have to be a partnership between the federal government, private sector, working with local governments to figure out what the challenges and the issues are, and then educating us on how to approach it.
Amazing. Let's talk a little bit about those partnerships. But before we do that, Secretary Geller, I want to pull on a thread that you mentioned that I think is sometimes an area of the thread that we don't talk about enough, which is how all of these new technologies from social media and AI can also be leveraged to harass and target the people who are in charge of administering the elections. And you talked a little bit about the burden. What does that look like in practice for you? And how are you also thinking about those social media harms, not just to the integrity of the election in abstract, but also to the day-to-day of the people who administer and make those elections happen?
Well, I'm going to start with 2 things that we did this last legislative session. We made it a felony to harass or intimidate election workers. We're one of the first states in the country to do that. Along with that, we passed an anti-doxing bill. So if an election official is doxed, that individual whoever it is, will be held accountable. And that's an important part. I know, and now talking with Senator Klobuchar out of Minnesota, she's trying to pass this legislation at the federal level so that all state elections officials have this coverage. And it's just going to take time for the federal government to get there. But in Nevada, we had to react. Again, like I said, 11 of the 17 clerks were new. One of those is already turned over in a 6-month period. So we have an individual in Washoe County, which is the battleground county of a battleground state, new. She's not new to elections, but she's new to that leadership position. And so it's looking at, and social media, I have to be as aggressive about being out front on these issues. So when we see a trend or we see something starting to come out, like last week, for example, mail ballots came out in Nevada, and the state Republican Party decided to do a caucus instead of using the state-run primary. Well, every Republican in Nevada got a ballot for the state Republican primary. There was one individual absent from that ballot, and it's because he chose to participate in the caucus. But people didn't know the dynamics of that and were confused, and they immediately thought I had removed him from the ballot. And that wasn't the situation at all. I even had a really good friend of mine who is, a deep Republican, but he supports me, and he's been one of my biggest supporters. He called me upset. He said, what is going on? And I explained it to him. He goes, oh, that makes sense. He goes, I know you would have it covered. But it's those types of misinformation that are out there that got started on social media, and it just kind of blew up. And I had to get on the phone and call some of the major media outlets and say, hey, this is your time to participate in this process, and I need you to explain why this occurred without me having to say, I could only say it so many times. I needed third-party validators to come in and then explain the situation.
That's a formidable segue to also talk about the role that the media is going to play in this year of elections. Before we do that, let's go back to this moment where you turn to the federal government and you say, what are you doing? And Dr. Nelson, let's talk about what you did when you were in this situation. So you worked at the White House. We talked about this, and truly you were the architect of the U.S. AI Bill of Rights. It's an extraordinary important document that centers the right of the people in the face of these systems, and that really was the cornerstone upon which the AI executive order of the White House was built. Tell us a little bit about the right way to regulate AI and what we can expect the government to do in this context.
Thank you for that question. I think we're figuring it out. I mean, so I think, but we do know a few things. We know that AI can be really cool, interchanging, and working with chatbots can be fascinating. It feels magical, but it is engineering work, it's statistics, it's math. It might be mathy math, but it is math nevertheless. But it feels like magic to people. And so I think sometimes for policymakers and legislators, it creates a kind of brain fog around the levers and tools that they have to do to regulate systems. So, we kind of in our heads, I think, in policy spaces sometimes place AI in this special category. And so you just, and so it's like, well, if a tool or system is discriminating, but it's AI, what do we do? It's like, well, if it's illegal to discriminate or to dox or to harass in that space, it should still be illegal. It might be, the process of how to determine that, the process of how to determine who's culpable gets more complicated perhaps, but the act itself, the use itself is we know what we think about that as a community and in democratic communities. So I think the same is true. See, that's one of, I think, the theory of the case I think of right now for how to regulate AI. There are things that are use cases that are familiar to us in good and bad ways. And then there are things that will be new and different where we'll have to show some ingenuity and some agility and some swiftness. I think as Secretary Aguilar said, to come out right away and say, you can't dox, election officials, but that's not about AI. I mean, we should have done that for the last big election cycle as well. It wasn't, we knew 4 years ago that public officials, folks in the public eye were getting doxed and harassed. And so I think we just have to be a lot more nimble. When it comes to elections, I think part of the challenge is that I think we need to move forward with the learnings that we have from past elections. So we know that there was deception, there was misinformation, there was disinformation. People were given wrong information about how to access elections. They were given incorrect information about how to access, about the conclusion of elections, who won, who lost, the things about positions of candidates and the like. And what we know with AI technologies that are not magic, but the tools and systems sort of can make it easier to, sort of throw a wrench in an election process, whether that's at the voter level or in the providing information about the election. You can do it at scale, right? So we worried in the last election about sort of bot armies on social media. Now you can sort of automate that kind of misinformation and then also use social media to sort of amplify and disseminate it. So I think the sort of intensification of things that we already are worried about are things that we need to keep an eye on. And so I've been encouraged to see federal organizations like CISA, which is one of our important cybersecurity bodies, sort of really getting out in front and sort of advising, bringing together secretaries of state fairly regularly and being really good about disseminating information. But I think fundamentally we don't know what this big AI election year is going to mean. And so we can be ready for the things that we think we know. We can, I think, pull forward and draw from some of what we learned from the last big election cycle. And then I think also be humble about the fact that we just don't know what might be coming as well.
All right. That sounds
encouraging.
fun.
Yeah.
So what do we do when we don't know? I guess we try to figure out. And you talked about what we learned the last cycle around. I remember a few of these lessons. It's a complicated landscape because, of course, you have different folks on different platforms and a lot of issues we've had, of course, around the role that social media played in spreading mis and disinformation and, of course, information operations. There's a problem we didn't have back then that we're definitely going to have in 2024. And it's about almost a new voice that people are going to interact with, and it's that of those AI chatbots. You talked a little bit about whether we can fear how people are going to use AI to maybe create new types of disinformation campaign. But there's another whole dimension, which is people are now going to turn to AI systems, maybe asking them a question. That's new. That's interesting. Some of those big makers of those chatbots have started to come out with their policies. We saw OpenAI election policies published last week. One of the things they said, for instance, is they're going to leverage the policy of refusal, right? Sometimes they will simply instruct the chatbot not to answer specific questions that they think is not yet appropriate to answer with AI. That's interesting. How do we verify what is really happening when people turn to these chatbots, and the type of questions that may be asked and the type of answers they will receive. Julia, I know that this question is at the heart of what you're going to do tomorrow with a few of us. Tell us about that and how you see this as important for preparing this global year of election.
Absolutely. Before I do that, though, I just want to I feel like Alondra underhyped what she did at the White House, so I'm just going to do one little thing, which is that the entire conversation about AI safety at that point was about whether the AI was going to become so smart that it would take over the world and then the computers would kill us. Do you remember this conversation? Yeah. And I feel like single-handedly, Alondra was like, actually, why don't we focus on the real risks that are on the ground and really change the entire conversation around the world to be about the real risks that AI is happening right now. And so that is why when I started to get curious about this question of whether AI, what was going to happen in this election year, I came to Alondra and I was like, I have this crazy idea. Why don't we try to test the bots? So basically tomorrow we're having an event where Secretary Aguilar and a whole bunch of other election officials are coming in to test the chatbots and ask them questions like, where should I vote? And like, what does such and such candidate think about this issue? And just ask the kind of questions that a voter would ask to AI, because that's the kind of question voters ask. I'm sure they call your office and ask those things all the time. And they put those questions into Google, and the AI technology is being built into a lot of the search engines, into all sorts of applications, and people are also going directly to ChatGPT and others, including my teenage son, who thinks it's a really great way to do his homework. And so we know that people are going to use these tools and ask questions, and we wanted to know what are the answers, because the reality is right now, a lot of people are putting out policies, but actually there isn't been a lot of rigorous testing on this question. And the reason is that it's actually hard to evaluate the answers, right? You can't, like, a lot of questions about voting are actually kind of complicated. Where is my polling place? Well, it depends on where you are, and like it might have changed from last time. And then what is the policy on mail ballots? Like, it changes, and things change a lot. And so it's not so simple to find those answers. And we have, and so you need experts to basically determine if those are the correct answers. And people treat AI like a monolith, but actually they're different products and they're all competing with each other. So essentially what we're doing is testing, we're asking the same question to multiple different chatbots and evaluating their answers with experts in the room who know how to evaluate those answers. And
so just so that people know who's on the hook, do you want to list the chatbots that are going to go undergo testing tomorrow?
So we're doing, you kind of have to do the big four. So there's OpenAI's ChatGPT, there's Anthropic's Claude, there's Google's Gemini, which is their latest one that used to be Bard, and there's Meta's Llama, and then we've added in the French open source model Mistral, which is actually like the hot new model these days. It's good to have two.
French will take that.
Open, yeah, as representing your country well. But we wanted to have two open source models because there's also a big policy debate about whether open source in general is more dangerous and riskier than the closed source models. And I guess I would just add one thing, which is I really believe as a journalist that this is the kind of work journalists should be doing, which is trying to measure the reality on the ground. I feel like our job is to be sort of forensics on behalf of the public, right? And so the exercise here is meant to create a data set that will be available to the public. Anyone can see the results of what we found. So researchers, other journalists can have some sense when they look at additional things and be like, oh, interesting. It seems like Llama has a history of doing this kind of thing, right? Like then there'll be some context and grounding for future articles about AI.
That's so immensely important.
And this is partly what I meant also about what we don't know. I mean, we don't have basic use testing, in part by design, from the companies of these kinds of questions. And so we do, so it's so important to have election officials, we have AI domain experts, people who have, written on the history of voter suppression. We have historians and other kinds of scholars as well. So we're taking the expertise about elections very seriously in the conversation as well.
And I think as an election official, sometimes we see and hear things from academia that come to us, and then you look at the report and you say, okay, who was part of this process? And there was nobody from the election space actually engaged with the academics having this conversation. So you immediately go, yeah, okay, they have no clue what actually happens on the ground. And this is so important because we're talking about AI and chatbots, but in reality, if you polled the 17 clerks in Nevada and asked them how comfortable they were with social media, I guarantee you only 15% of them would say, yeah, I know how to use it. The others would be like, oh no, not touching it. And they're also in rural communities, especially in Nevada. Geographically, from the urban core, we have two major cities, Reno and Las Vegas. Outside of that is a large rural community, and they don't have exactly the access to this. And then you get into tribal communities, which don't usually have access to Wi-Fi and the internet. And so now, what are you doing to really get people to understand the challenges election officials have in getting information to the voters? So I'm really excited that they did bring in the actual election administrators, both at the state and local levels, to talk about these issues. So thank you.
I think it's going to be a really interesting day tomorrow. I'd love to hear from you. What do you think your constituents are going to turn to these chatbots to ask? Like, what are the types of election questions that you think is top of mind that you're wondering, oh, I don't know if a chatbot can get this right, and that you're excited to test tomorrow?
So we've already done a little bit of it, and just out of curiosity in the office is, when's election day? And it'll tell you like next week, and it's not really an election day. Oh my God. And it's like, where's my polling site? And it gives you, and you're like, that's not accurate at all. And so we were like, oh man, this is going to be fascinating. But it's something we just have to learn to deal with. It's another issue, it's another category, it's another silo that election officials are going to be burdened with to try to figure out, because the constituencies are using it, especially the youth voter. Because right now, every new registered voter in America is what's called a digital native, and probably all of you are digital natives. You grew up with a phone, a tablet in your hand, and you're wondering how this archaic system of voting works, especially when you get a mail ballot in the mail and you're like, what is this? Why can't I just do this on my phone? And so it's those type of challenges as we shift generations is gonna have to figure this out.
So if I can, we're like getting unruly, Camille, I'm sorry.
Okay.
But I think one way to think about this is voter-centric, and I think there's a lot of testing to be done that sort of centers the subject position of the voter and trying to sort of test the chatbots. But you could also imagine, election officials using chatbots to translate materials, right? I mean, there's districts that are very multilingual, and maybe you got enough budget from your county to translate in 3 languages, but you've got these other 2 or 3 populations or languages, and how well is that happening? I mean, we won't be able to do that tomorrow, but I mean, that's a really important question. I come from California, where there are, 900-page referenda. We were like the home of Prop 13 and all of these. And, you could imagine an election official or, a voter being sort of like, what are the sort of 3 points of this? Because I can't read all of this. I had got the booklet in the mail, and as, a good citizen, I'd set aside time to do it, but you're super busy and you want to go vote, and you just have got to go vote. So you could imagine popping into a chat bot, asking it to distill, how well is that happening? How well are they reporting candidates' positions? If an election official needs to quickly create materials for an election, I mean, there's a whole range of ways, particularly with generative AI as a general purpose tool. Anything we might use computation for, you could imagine being used in that sort of full life cycle of an election. And again, we don't know. There's so much we don't know.
And, in that older ways, the myriad of ways in which we're going to see candidates and campaigns use those new tools, some of them we can sort of look at and say, well, that doesn't seem to be a great idea. So for instance, some of the tech companies have said, we don't think it's a great idea for people to use our AI tools in order to impersonate others. So please do not create a chatbot that pretends to be an office, a branch of government, or a candidate. And Another one I think is more complicated is this question of targeted persuasion. Last week, for instance, OpenAI said, we don't really know what's the impact of using AI to do targeted persuasion on voters. We're just going to go ahead and for now say, let's not do that. Is that clear cut? Julia, you've seen, you've worked so much on targeted persuasion. Do you think that when you ask to translate and sort of maybe culturally adapt material for a voter, is that targeted persuasion? How do you navigate this sort of new tool that people now have access to do targeted persuasion and campaign? And what do you want to test out of that?
Yeah, I mean, those OpenAI rules that they put out were so vague that it's I don't even know how you would implement it. But I will tell you that every day I ask these chatbots in our little tool to write an ode to Donald Trump or a poem about Joe Biden and how amazing he is. And they love writing poetry. Something about these bots, they just love poets. And so I can get them to do all sorts of crazy poems every single day. So whatever guardrails they put in is not preventing any of that.
And it's a good one because, when we think about the intersection of AI and democracy, the often first things that come to mind is this question of accuracy. Is that the right answer? Those people are going to ask this important question. We want them to have the right answer. Another very important topic that Dr. Nelson, you spend a lot of time bringing attention on is all the questions around bias. We know that in those AI systems are embedded biases that might have odd effects when they write poetry about one candidate or another. Can you share a little bit more about how that will come up tomorrow in the way that we're going to ask everybody to evaluate for those results and how that worries you when we think about elections?
Well, it's certainly, Julia sort of suggested the really amazing tool that the proof team built out, which is software that will help us to pull down the information and evaluate it. And the criteria, the things that we're looking at are how accurate are these? Is the answer complete? Is the answer biased? And sort of thinking those through. And some of them will be obvious, right? If it tells you gives you the wrong phone number or the wrong URL for an election site, which has happened in some of our testing already, that's just wrong. But questions around bias, are you sorting information to certain groups or certain, election sort of districts in different ways? What's the historical information if you're asking questions about a candidate over time in a particular district? So these are the things that we might think about. And a lot of the challenges with regards to bias issues and discrimination issues and AI more generally are about the challenge of porting that historical data to the present. And so, even with chatbots, which use large language models or generative AI, you still are porting prediction of, the sequence of words from the past or from past usage. So we do have the constraint of the past universe shaping what the current questions might be. And then, of course, we know some of the companies, the sort of training data that they use stopped in 2021 and 2022. So you also have accuracy issues around when the data was brought into the training set and into the model. So we'll see. Again, there's a lot we don't know. It will be interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the bias issue is really important because, as we know, in the U.S., there are a lot of efforts to suppress the vote in certain communities, and a lot of that has to do with providing information that makes it seem difficult to vote or dangerous or do you remember the Russian misinformation was trying to make it feel like it didn't matter what the outcome was going to be of the election, so just trying to feel a feeling of despair, right? And so we do know that those strategies are used to suppress the vote. And so the question is, can you make the bots do that, right? And we haven't run all of the tests yet, but I would just say so far I've not seen any indications of any guardrails around any of that so far.
Secretary Aguilar, how do you think about this in the context of Nevada?
It's just, again, elections have been run the same way for decades. And now you're throwing in a lot of fast change to individuals who've been there for a decade or a couple decades working in this space, you're already making them uncomfortable. And so how do you get them to be comfortable with being uncomfortable? And what we're doing is, one, we're using technology to build efficiency within the offices and across the 17 counties. Our governor and legislature gave me an appropriation of $30 million to build an election management system. We call it VREMS. And it's going to help us build consistency across the entire state. It's going to help build a voter registration system that is easier for the voter to use so that they can keep their information updated consistently, and that making sure that we're getting mailed ballots to the intended recipient. There's not multiple ballots being sent to a single voter. So you talk about that technology and then adding on AI, and we're actually looking at using AI because we're producing about a 200-page manual to run elections. Well, these county clerks who have 3 jobs in one position, they have a question, they can go to that AI bot, ask the question, and it pulls from that manual. But that's a controlled environment. Then you start to think, okay, what happens once this becomes an open environment? And what information are they pooling to make decisions about the administration of that election? So it's teaching them how to look at it and be a critical thinker about the information they're receiving to make sure it's accurate. And so we're working really hard to get them comfortable with this technology on top of everything else they have to do. I spoke to 6 of our 17 yesterday just to get a feel of where they were for early voting starts on Saturday, just getting a sense of where they are mentally, just physically, and where I could be helpful to them. And you just hear in their voice how hard they are working, how passionate they are about what they're doing, because they know how important Nevada is to the rest of the country, and they know we're going to be under the light for everything that we do. And so it's just trying to, how do you change perception? How do you educate without overwhelming, but also to make them comfortable enough to use this technology to make their lives better? Because you don't want them to be afraid of it, but you want them to be, again, a critical thinker about the information, the way they're using it.
And to your point, when it's in a controlled environment, when it's designed for a specific purpose, it can be extraordinarily helpful. Dr. Nelson, that's the other example that you were talking about, right? It helps navigate complicated documents, get accurate answers out of specific corpuses of text. Are there other ways in which you would like to see the state sort of better seize AI for democracy or to enhance the efficiency and integrity of elections?
I think it's going to be the secretaries, and I think it's going to be specifically the battleground secretaries coming together as a cohort and convincing the federal government that there needs to be consistent funding for this, and we need to employ individuals who are smart to help us develop that. Right now, we are very schizophrenic in the way we fund elections. The federal government has deemed us a critical infrastructure, but they fund us in a reactionary way, so you're getting reactionary results. So my idea is, look, if we can get a long-term strategic funding, which in this Congress, I don't know how possible that is, we will make better decisions about our investment in elections, and we can build safeguards and rails around these types of initiatives. And it's just getting the battlegrounds. It's not a Democratic issue, it's not a Republican issue. It's about our elections and our democracy. And so we need to have this cross-collaboration. And I'm grateful for the fact that, the 6 battleground secretaries have open lines of communication, and we're able to talk about issues and be able to come to a conclusion or a solution about, hey, this is the path we're going to go together.
So can I respond to this? I mean, you had asked me earlier, Camille, how do we regulate AI? So one of the ways, one answer is, don't think it's magic. What are the things you can already use? Another is to build a muscle to be ready for things that you can anticipate, to be ready for what you don't know. And the challenge of that with elections is that I think the AI conversation and the AI and election conversation is very much how do we make it stop? How do we fix it? As opposed to, and this goes to Secretary Aguilar's response around funding, this is going to be a constant sort of challenge, threat, ongoing, iterative, moving, dynamic thing. And so you can't just fix it for one election. I mean, one of the things you had asked, what has the government done? Part of the President Biden's executive order, has really encouraged new kinds of coalitions that we're already getting underway around watermarking and sort of digital watermarking and provenance around sort of multimodal AI, video and images and the like, that's not going to fix it. It is going to be a kind of, you can do that for a time and then people can take it out and then you'll have to do another thing. And it's a bit more like fraud. I mean, it's more like, how is the government going to fix financial fraud? We're never going to fix it. It's going to be a constant sort of, we might say, pas de deux.
Yes. Yes. Intricate, wonderful dance.
Yes, exactly.
Where we dance together towards innovation.
Yes.
But here are two partners in the pas de deux that seem to no longer be able to dance together in 2024, and that's Silicon Valley and the US government, with new constraints on how much the federal government can coordinate with major Silicon Valley players to stop disinformation, to maybe exchange information on the type of threats they're seeing. What does that do to this election preparedness and to the need that you've all talked about having a multi-stakeholder approach? And how are you thinking about this in 2024?
Do you want to? I think it's a challenge. I mean, I would say, having watched over the last year what's happened in Washington, there's been a kind of carrot and stick, I think, with the companies, right? So there were voluntary commitments that happened in the summer around watermarking, around getting companies to be more transparent around high capability, in particular AI systems, some of that driven by a national security imperative. I will say, just from a pure marketing perspective, none of these companies, I think, want to mess up this election. I mean, that might be the outcome, but I don't think they want their products to be tied to, experiences that mar elections and sort of further erode democracy. So I think fundamentally, the player that we've not mentioned so far, at least in the U.S. context, is the Congress. And I think, the administration has gone quite far, done quite a lot, both with carrot and stick, I think, but fundamentally you need legislation. And even the legislation, I think in some instances, you can mitigate, but you can't stop it. I mean, so the extraordinary leadership that they've shown in Nevada around harassment of election officials, it's not going to stop harassment of election officials. You can hope it will sort of mitigate it. So it's going to be a kind of ongoing struggle, and I think that we want to sort of have patience, and I think I'm hearing a lot like, is watermarking going to stop, me seeing videos of Secretary Clinton endorsing Ron DeSantis, right? Or we had, or
the answer to that is no.
The answer to that is
everybody
no.
knows. The answer
right.
is no. Okay.
Or President Biden robocalls in New
Yes.
Hampshire. But how do we put sort of speed bumps, and how do we get people a bit more resilient around the fact that this is a kind of new part of the reality of elections?
It's about building that muscle for innovation and the coalitions we're going to need for rapid response.
Yeah.
Well, it's being
right?
comfortable with it first and understanding the basic premise of what it means. I sit on an investment committee for a university foundation endowment, and a major fund came in to speak and give an update, and they talked about AI and the amount of investment that's going into AI. And I'm sitting there going, this is not going to get any easier. This is going to get tougher. We need to get ahead of it, and we need to be smart about it, because we're not going to beat it and we're not going to hold it back. It's going to fly fast. And if we don't start to address it, we're going to be completely left behind. But I'm comfortable with the fact that we're starting here. We're going to get there.
Can I just add something? Because I feel like it's getting a little too optimistic up here.
I was looking at you for that, Julia.
But I just want to say that, one thing that I think is really, really hard about the AI situation is that it is creating we already had this misinformation and disinformation, but now it is really creating a mistrust of all information. Yeah. And that, as a journalist whose entire job is to try to create factual, trustworthy information, is really the thing that I feel like at a meta level I'm most worried about, because it allows everyone to just be like, oh, that's probably fake, to anything that they don't want to believe, right? And people feel that way already, but now they kind of have a license to do that. And so I have to say, I am really concerned about that. And that's one of the reasons I want to do this benchmarking, because one of the things we're going to find out tomorrow is if one of these bots is better. And I would like to like have them compete on quality. And so one thing we're gonna say is like, okay, like Meta was great or Claude was great or whatever, or if any of them emerge great. And I mean, fingers crossed, I don't know. But I do think there's an important element of this where we need there to be quality, trustworthy information in the world. And the fact that AI, which is a wrong name, okay? I just want to say, what is intelligent about a thing that makes up stuff? It actually is not designed for accuracy, like just fundamentally not designed for accuracy. And so I have been advocating hopelessly for them to be renamed poetry bots, but no one is buying that. But I do feel like if we had that sort of sense about them, which is like, no, they're just talking stuff, right? I still feel like we do need there to be sources of truth, right? And it does, I think, also mean that places like the elections officials' websites have to be the source of truth, right? Like I've noticed as I've been reading them all, what I really love is a lot of the websites now have myths and about like elections and debunking them. And that is really important, I think, because there has to be a trustworthy source of information. And unfortunately, journalism, as much as we try, is also at the lowest ebb of public trust right now.
But however, there has to be investment from the local level in those websites. If you take my website in Nevada, that thing is like the greatest historical document because nothing has been removed from the website. It just gets piled on. It just becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. But the bottom of the pile is no longer relevant to current day.
Yeah.
And so yet that it's critical infrastructure.
It is, and so we went to our legislature and said, we need $200,000. They were going to give us $50,000 to redo the website. And I was like, that's going to get us a domain name. It's not going to get us to a point where we can go through and wash out all the irrelevant information on there. Because when a person goes on there, if they can't find the information quickly, they're going to be gone and they're not going to get the answer they wanted. So we need to be smarter about minimal technology that our governments use. And so it's going to take investment, and it's going to take voters like you calling your legislator and saying, hey, we need to do a better job of this. But we can't do it unless the voter makes it a priority.
Not to mention all of that outdated information has now been absorbed by multiple robots who have been training on it.
Into training data. I'm not optimistic. You know I'm not that optimistic. I mean, what I was trying to describe, and maybe somebody, if there's a Columbia College student in the core, is the mythic character like pushing the rock up the hill, like times infinity, I mean, like I think that we are really having to tuck in for, a kind of marathon, in part because now what we have with generative AI are like systems that are often moving. I mean, a lot of our regulatory and governance things have been around things that we hope to stay still. We counted on that website being like having a kind of like archaeological quality to it, as opposed to the information being super dynamic. So, probably, yeah.
But
it's exhausting. I'm exhausted.
As an election leader, I have to keep 17 individuals motivated.
Yes.
In a very hard, difficult time. And if I'm the continual pessimist, they're not going to be motivated because they're just going to be like, it doesn't matter. And so we have to figure out how to keep people moving forward. Sometimes I feel like a coach. You're just trying to get the team of Bad News Bears to realize that we could win. And so sometimes they're like, oh my gosh, stop with the optimism. But the thing in this situation, I wish, yes, we are very optimistic, but at the same time, we truly understand our challenges. But if we don't, I can't convince a legislator or a governor to make investment in these areas if I don't have a vision and a plan that seems realistic and I can accomplish it. And I can't get a voter there either. So I agree with you that, yes, optimism sometimes may be the way we're going, but in reality, I know where we are.
Yeah, sorry, I just want to retract my accusation.
So we're not retracting the poetry bots?
No, I'm totally for the poetry bots, but I do think like that I think the way journalism operates and the way I like to think of journalism doing its best service is to diagnose problems as specifically and accurately as possible, because that makes them achievable to solve, right? And so essentially, I am an optimist because I have this dream that when I diagnose a problem as a journalist, it will get solved. I will tell you that the history of that happening is like, 50-50, but it's still better than not knowing about
But we
the
keep
problem.
at it.
Yeah, we
And I
keep
think
at it.
One of the things that we're trying to do at IGP2, we started this program on AI and democracy with this idea that we were going to ask the absolutely depressing question with great optimism and rigor.
Yeah.
And that makes me very excited to go break some chatbots with you three tomorrow. And we'll take a few questions from the room. All right. Let's take, that's a lot of
Wow,
questions.
so many
All right,
questions.
fantastic. See, we're going to also have like entire teams who will want to break chatbots with us. Can somebody help me take questions in the room? Fantastic. Let's do that.
Oh, okay. Hi. No. Yeah. Hi. Thank you very much. That was really interesting. My name is Ben, and I'm a second-year student here at SEPA. You spoke quite a bit about the challenges that are facing the U.S. with the upcoming election, and looking at previous disinformation campaigns on social media, not necessarily involving AI. Oftentimes, it's been interesting to see that in a country like the U.S., government is able to take certain steps to counter these disinformation campaigns, but in countries which don't have the same level of institutional stability, in lower income countries, countries which are just transitioning into democracy, those challenges can be much greater. So I was wondering, how does this situation look for all of the other elections that we're going to have in the world this year? How can countries which don't necessarily have the funding or the institutional know-how to counter threats to AI react to all of this? Because if it's already a pretty negative picture in the US, one can wonder how it looks elsewhere. Thank you.
Great question. Let's take two more and do a batch of three. I am. Right. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Liz, and my question for you, I'm going to push back a little bit on the pas de deux analogy and tell you, I think it's pas de trois, because you've got Silicon Valley, and you can't hide from the partisanship. You've got the Dems on one side, and you've got the GOP on the other. So I have worked on the election administration side, and I've also worked as a, thank you. I've also worked as a disinfo researcher, and it's been my experience that the platforms really push back, which is something to consider, right? It's easy to tell the feds, hey, y'all have to take care of this, but they're dealing with really high-powered lobbyists pushing back against efforts to address this, and you get two very different responses from the two parties. You know, you've got GOP essentially shutting down people like Secretary Mayorkas when he tries to deal with, you know, these issues and saying the government's coming for you. How do you address that? You know, how do you push back against these partisan attacks where it's like the government is coming for your information? And it's sort of something that the for-profit folks latch onto to push back against efforts to regulate the industry. How do you deal with that?
It's a great question. Let's take a third one in the back.
Some paper. I know it was.
I'll recap them.
Oh, okay. Okay, thanks, Cami.
Hi, I'm Julia. I'm a grad student in computer science. And my question is, where are the engineers? And what, like, I understand, you know, we have CISA, which is a fairly new agency, but like where is the like political action to kind of replicate those kinds of agencies on a local level? Because CISA is great, but it's, you know, federal, and I mean, its scope is limited. And are you guys seeing, you know, that kind of structural support from, you know, public service-minded engineers? And if not, like, where's the push to get that involved?
Compensation.
All right. Hi, this is me, moderator bot. We have three questions. The first one talks about what can, you know, global elections learn from what's happening in America, or maybe what can we learn from what's happening elsewhere? How do you do all of this maybe without the infrastructure and means of the United States of America? Second question is, we used to have somewhat of a bipartisan consensus on disinfo, misinfo that seems to be brittling. What do you do in the face of how partisan those questions are becoming, including in their violence, with people maybe suing, maybe harassing the folks who are working on election integrity? How do you handle that? And the third question, was where are the engineers? What is this public interest tech field that we've been calling for? Where are they? If they're somewhere, why are they not here with us or coming? And how we can make them come faster? You get to pick. You don't have to do all of them. You get to pick. Let's go in order. Julia, let's start with you.
I'm gonna take public interest technology.
You can do that.
As you may or may not know, there's like a growing movement to try to build a field around public interest technology. As a journalist, I grew up in Silicon Valley, learned to code in 5th grade, and then fell in love with journalism and started recruiting engineers to work with me. And so essentially my idea of journalism is, like, for instance, in this case, to build software for AI testing. This is not how every journalist behaves, but I think there needs to be way more of it. And also there needs to be way more of it inside of government agencies. And it's very hard for journalists and for government agencies to compete on the price tag for a great engineer these days. But I will say that as somebody who's recruited many of them to journalism over the years, there are also a lot of really motivated techies who don't want to just optimize ads for a living. And so I have been able to find them. And I think that the thing that is really hard right now is, honestly, journalism as a field is collapsing. You might have noticed that. And so so the money all went to the platforms, right? And so there's no money left. So it's a really hard time to say, which I'm trying to do right now, start a new journalism studio, staffed with expensive technologists. This is a hard thing to do. And I think it's also hard when you're trying to build an agency to say to your boss, I need all these really expensive programmers. So I guess what I'm saying is I 100% agree with you that they're needed. And we just need money to rain down from the sky.
It's getting there. Right now there's a public interest technology track at DEF CON, the major cybersecurity conference.
Yep.
So the field is slowly emerging.
Yep.
I think funding is a big need that you've both highlighted. Dr. Nelson,
Yeah, I mean,
which will you pick?
I'm going to do a little public interest technology and a little global election.
Nobody wants to talk to partisanship is what I'm saying.
I'm going to leave that to Secretary Aguilar, to the elected official. We'll leave that to him. I mean, I guess I would say our project includes engineers. So if you didn't hear that, what we were trying to emphasize here is that we think that with general purpose tools, that the specificity of the use case matters, and that you want, of course, engineers, and you want AI policy people, but you also want people. I hope that part of the value add is, like, we are also bringing some very serious domain experts here. And I think you could have imagined this being done precisely as Secretary Aguilar said, with a bunch of academics and engineers, and putting out a paper in archive and being clear that you never talk to an election official. So I want to, we have a very intentional thing that we're doing here, and it does include engineers. I would also say, even from the, one of the one of the many mandates of President Biden's 111-page executive order on AI, which will be historic, I think, for all sorts of reasons, is to really work on capacity and getting more engineers and scientists into government. I would say we want the right kind of engineers. I mean, I think part of how we got here is through a kind of strong turn to engineering in a lot of domains in government and elsewhere. And that you want, I mean, even NIST now is using the term socio-technical. You want people who can think about engineering plus, or who can think about sociological plus engineering, or poetry plus engineering, or whatever. And so I also want us to be, I think, careful about thinking about what that category means. On the international, I think, it's a complicated question. I think those of us, if you do international affairs, the United States has had a complicated history of helping people with their democratic elections around the world. I mean, so on the one hand, one doesn't want to necessarily replicate that, but you could imagine, UN bodies or other sorts of bodies helping to sort of, I think build capacity to understand what's happening with WhatsApp. And, I think a lot of places where you're not going to have the infrastructure for, AI systems, Secretary Aguilar mentioned communities that don't even really have broadband. So if we think about the global majority as being more consistent with that, I think it's sort of hard to know. The other thing I would say is, it feels like a place to lean in on companies to the extent that we can, right? The generative AI companies are mostly American, and if there is, if they're voicing a commitment to democracy and to being a certain kind of player in the global stage, you can think about Sam Altman last summer traveling almost like an elected official and having visits with head of state. What is the obligation that comes with that for powerful American companies? So I'm posing just more questions to you, but I think I would want to be careful and sort of saying that the U.S. should do something about these other elections. Yeah.
So I'm going to answer the fun question first, the international question. 5 years ago, I had the opportunity to live in Germany through their election process, and it was fascinating to me to see that. And this is prior to me ever thinking I was going to be in politics. The other is I've been to 87 countries, and in those opportunities, I've been able to see a lot, learn a lot. And through the campaign cycle, we had news media embedded with our campaign outside of the United States consistently. One, I was comfortable with it. Two is it was important for them to see what we do on a local level to win an election. But also, two, they were scared out of their minds because they knew if I had lost to my opponent, who was the most dangerous election denier in the country and a battleground state, we were going to be in trouble. And so I knew the burden I had to get the message across, to give them the opportunity to see our process firsthand. The other, and it's just understanding that we don't live in a silo. We have a responsibility as the United States to know what role we play globally. We don't have to be the hero and savior for everyone, but we have to protect this democracy experience. And if we don't protect it and give people a firsthand view, we're going to be in trouble. So that's one I really enjoy. I know it's outside my realm as a state elected officials to think on a global perspective. The other thing we did is during the legislative cycle, we brought in a fellow from Indonesia to see how our democracy worked from a state legislative perspective. Going back to bipartisanship, every major piece of legislation we passed in my office, I went to our Republican governor and said, this is what I want to do. Do you have concerns? Where can I moderate this legislation to meet your expectations? And to tell you, I did the same thing with our budget. And our budget invested so heavily in voter access. And at first I thought this is going to go nowhere. But once I showed him the data and I showed him how it benefited Nevada as a whole, I was able to bring him on board. And like our legislation to protect election workers, that passed both houses of the legislature unanimously. And it was in committee, and the assembly suspended the rules, both Republicans and Democrats, to send that legislation immediately from the committee directly to the floor for a vote so we could get the governor to sign it. So it's making sure I have to make an extra effort to go and talk to people, to explain to them, to listen. Sometimes it's very uncomfortable to be in these environments, especially when people have no trust of anything. But you have to listen to them no matter how uncomfortable it is.
That's a great note to end on. I will ask you as we close this panel together to give me very quickly one thing you're looking for in tomorrow's testing. Julia, I start with you. One thing that you're looking forward to as we go bricks and bots tomorrow.
Honestly, I would like to see one of these bots be accurate about anything.
Okay, that works. Accuracy in at least one. Dr. Nelson.
I'm worried about a lot of death by 1,000 cuts. So a lot of little inaccuracies, a lot of little bit of bias, and so that everything is just sort of meh to bad, and what that means cumulatively, over the course of the set of prompts and questions that we'll engage in, but also what it means cumulatively for a society and the sort of truth decay and erosion that Julia was talking about that keeps her up at night.
My goal is to really understand this and to be able to explain it to those that don't have this opportunity, and to be able to explain it to a Nevada voter and have them become educated about the process. And I can't do it until I understand it. So.
That's great. Thanks, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for sharing.